Swan's way, continuing from page 30. Then she went out with an air of resignation that seemed to signify, if this isn't a misfortune for parents to have a child like that. She came back after a moment to tell me that they were still only at the ice stage, that it was impossible for the butler to deliver the letter right away in front of everyone, but that when the mouth-rinsing bowls were put round, they would find a way to hand it to Mamma. Instantly, my anxiety subsided. It was now no longer, as it had only been a moment ago, until tomorrow that I had left my mother, since my little no doubt annoying her, and doubtly because this stratagem would make me ridiculous in Swan's eyes, would at least allow me, invisible and enraptured, to enter the same room as she, would whisper about me in her ear, since that forbidden, hostile dining room, where just a moment before, the ice itself, the granite, and the rinsing bowls seemed to me to contain pleasures noxious and mortally sad because Mamma was enjoying them far away from me, was opening itself to me, and like a fruit that has turned sweet and burst its skin, was about to project all the way into my intoxicated heart. Mamma's attention as she read my lines. Now, I was no longer separated from her. The barriers were down. An exquisite thread joined us. And that was not all. Mamma would probably come. I thought Swann would surely have laughed at the anguish I had just suffered if he read my letter and guessed its purpose. Yet, on the contrary, as I later learned, a similar anguish was the torment of long years of his life, and no one, perhaps, could have understood me as well as he. In his case, the anguish that comes from feeling that the person you love is in a place of amusement where you are not, where you cannot join her, came to him through love, to which it is in some sense predestined, by which it will be hoarded, appropriated. But when, as in my case, this anguish enters us before love has made its appearance in our lives, it drifts as it waits for us, vague and free, without a particular assignment, at the service of feeling one day, of another the next day. Sometimes the filial tenderness or affection for a friend, and the joy with which I served my first apprenticeship when Francois came back to tell me my letter would be delivered to Swann. Swann, too, had known well that deceptive joy given to us by some friend, some relative of the woman we love, when arriving at the house or theater where she is for some dance gala evening or premiere at which he is going to see her. This friend notices us and wandering outside, desperately awaiting some opportunity to communicate with her. He recognizes us, speaking to us familiarly, asks us what we are doing there, and when we invent the story that we have something urgent to say to his relative or friend, he assures us that nothing could be simpler, leads us into the hall, and promises to send her to us in 5 minutes. How we love him! As at that moment I loved Francois, the well-intentioned intermediary who with a single word has just made tolerable, human, and almost propitious the unimaginable, infernal festivity into the thick of which we had been imagining that hostile, perverse, and exquisite vortices of pleasure were carrying away from us and inspiring with derisive laughter the woman we love. If we are to judge by him, the relative who has come up to us, and is himself also one of the initiates of the cruel mysteries, the other guests at the party cannot have anything very demoniacal about them. Those inaccessible and excruciating hours during which she was about to enjoy unknown pleasures, now, through an unexpected breach, we are entering them. Now one of the moments which, in succession, would have composed those hours, a moment as real as the others, perhaps more important to us, because our mistress is more involved in it We can picture to ourselves, we possess it, we are taking part in it, we have created it, almost. The moment in which we tell her we are here downstairs, and no doubt the other moments of the party would not have been essentially different from this one, would not have had anything more delectable about them that should make us suffer so, since the kind friend has said to us, "Why, she'll be delighted to come down. It'll be much nicer for her to chat with you than to be bored up there." Alas, Swann had learned by experience that good intentions of a third party have no power over a woman who is annoyed to find herself pursued, even in a party by someone she does not love. Often the friend comes back down alone. My mother did not come, and with no consideration for my pride, which was invested in her not denying the story that she was supposed to have asked me to let her know the result of some search, asked Francois to say these words to me. There is no answer. Words I have so often since heard than the doormen in grand hotels or the footmen in bawdy houses bring back to some poor girl who explains in surprise. "What? He said nothing? Why, that's impossible. Did you really give him my note? All right, I'll go on waiting." And just as she invariably assures him that she does not need the extra gas jet which the doorman wants to light for her, and remains there hearing nothing further but the few remarks about the weather exchanged by the doorman and the lackey whom he sends off suddenly when he notices the time to put a customer's drink on ice. Having declined Francois's offer to make me some tea or to stay with me, I let her return to the servants' hall. I went to bed and closed my eyes, trying not to hear the voices of my family, who were having their coffee in the garden. But after a few seconds, I became aware that by writing that note to Mamma, by approaching the risk of angering her so close to her that I thought I could touch the moment when I could see her again, I had shut off from myself the possibility of falling asleep without seeing her again, and the beating of my heart grew more painful each minute because I was increasing my agitation by telling myself to be calm, to accept my misfortune. Suddenly my anxiety subsided. A happiness invaded me as when a powerful medicine begins to take effect and our pain vanishes. I had just formed the resolution not to continue trying to fall asleep without seeing Mamma again, to kiss her at all costs, even though it was the certainty of being on bad terms with her for a long time after, when she came up to bed. The calm that came with the end of my distress filled me with an extraordinary joy, quite as much as did my expectation, my thirst for, and my fear of danger. I opened the window noiselessly and sat down on the foot of my bed. I hardly moved so that I would not be heard from below. Outdoors, too, things seemed to be frozen in silent attention, so as not to disturb the moonlight, which, duplicating and distancing each thing by extending its shadow before it, denser and more concrete than itself, had at once thinned and enlarged the landscape like a map that had been folded and was now opening out. What needed to move, that few leaves of the chestnut tree, moved. But the minute quivering, complete, executed even in its slightest nuances and ultimate refinements, did not spill over onto the rest, did not merge with it, remained circumscribed, exposed against this silence, which absorbed nothing of them. The most distant noises, those that must have come from the gardens that lay on the other side of town, could be perceived detailed with such finish that they seemed to owe this effect of remoteness only to their pianissimo, like those muted motifs so well executed by the orchestra of the Conservatoire, that although you do not lose a single note, you nonetheless think you're hearing them from far away from the concert hall. And all the old subscribers, my grandfather's sisters too, when Swann had given them his seats, strained their ears as if listening to the distant advances of an army on the march that had not yet turned the corner of the Rue de Trevis. I knew the situation I was now placing myself in was the one that could provoke the gravest consequences of all for me, coming from my parents, much graver in truth than a stranger would have supposed, the sort he would have believed could only be produced by truly shameful misdeeds. But in my upbringing, the order of misdeeds was not the same as in that of other children, and I had become accustomed to placing before all else, because there were probably no others from which I needed to be more carefully protected. Those two common characteristics I now understand was that you lapse into them by yielding to a nervous impulse, but at the same time, no one uttered these words, no one revealed this cause, which might have made me believe I was excusable for succumbing to them, or even perhaps incapable of resisting them. But I recognized them clearly from the anguish that preceded them, as well as from the rigor of the punishment that followed them. And I knew that the one I had just committed was in the same family as the others, for which I had been severely punished, though infinitely graver. When I went and placed myself in my mother's path at that moment, she was going up to bed, and when she saw I had stayed up to say good night to her in the hallway, they would not let me continue to live at home. They would send me away to school the next day. That much was certain. Well, even if I had to throw myself out the window 5 minutes later, I still had preferred this. What I wanted now was Mamma, to say good night to her. I had gone too far along the road that led to the fulfillments of that desire to be able to turn back now. I heard my parents' footsteps as they saw Swann out, and when the bell on the gate let me know he had gone, I went to the window. Mamma was asking my father if he thought the lobster was good, and if Monsieur Swann had been a more coffee and pistachio ice had more. I found it quite ordinary, said my mother. I think next time we'll have to try another flavor. I can't tell you how much changed I find Swann, said my great-aunt. He has aged so. My great-aunt was so used to seeing Swann always as the same adolescent that she was surprised to find him suddenly not as young as the age she continued to attribute to him, and my family was also beginning to feel that in him this aging was abnormal, excessive, shameful, and more deserved by the unmarried, by all those for whom, it seems, the great day has no tomorrow, is no longer than for others, because for them it is empty, and the moments in it add up from the morning, without being then divided among children. I think he has no end of worries with that wretched wife of his living with a certain Monsieur de Churlos. All of us at Cambrai know. It's the talk of the town. My mother pointed out that in spite of this, he had been looking much less sad for some time now. He also doesn't make that gesture of his as often, so like his father, of wiping his eyes and running his hand along his forehead. I think that in his heart of hearts, he no longer loves that woman. Why, naturally he doesn't love her any more, answered my grandfather. I received a letter from him about it a long time ago. By now, a letter which I hastened not to comply, and which leaves no doubt about his feelings, at least his feelings of love, for his wife. Well now, you see, you didn't thank him for the Asti, added my grandfather, turning to his two sisters-in-law. What? We didn't thank him? I think just between you and me that I put it quite delicately, answered my Aunt Flora. Yes, you managed it quite well. Quite admirable, said my Aunt Celine. But you were very good too. Yes, I was rather proud of my remark about kind neighbors. What? Is that what you call thanking him? Exclaimed my grandfather. I certainly heard that, but devil take me if I thought it was directed at Swann. You can be sure he never noticed. But see here, Swan isn't stupid. I'm sure he appreciated it. After all, I couldn't tell him how many bottles there were and what the wine cost. My father and mother were left alone there and sat down for a moment. Then my father said, "Shall we go up to bed?" "If you like, dear, even though I am not the least bit sleepy. Yet it couldn't be that perfectly harmless coffee ice that's keeping me so wide awake. But I can see a light in the servants' hall, and since poor Francois has waited up for me, I'll go and ask her to unhook my bodice while you're getting undressed." And my mother opened the lattice door that led from the vestibule to the staircase. Soon I heard her coming upstairs to close her window. I went without a sound into the hallway. My heart was beating so hard I had trouble walking, but at least it was no longer pounding from anxiety, but from terror and joy. I saw the light cast in the stairwell by Mamma's candle. Then I saw Mamma herself. I threw myself forward. In the first second she looked at me with astonishment, not understanding what could have happened. Then an expression of anger came over her face. She did not say a single word to me, and indeed for much less than this they would go several days without speaking to me. If Ma had said one word to me, it would have been an admission that they could talk to me again, and in any case, it would perhaps have seemed to me even more terrible as a sign that, given the gravity of the punishment that was going to be prepared for me, silence and estrangement would have been childish. A word would have been like the calm with which you answer a servant when you have decided to dismiss him, the kiss you give a son when you are sending off to enlist, whereas you would have refused it were you simply going to be annoyed with him for a few days. But she heard my father coming up from the dressing room, where he had gone to undress, and to avoid the scene he would make over me, she said to me in a voice choked with anger, "Run. Run, so at least your father won't see you waiting like this, as if you were out of your mind." But I repeated to her, "Come say good night to me," terrified as I saw the gleam from my father's candle rising up the wall, but also using his approach as a mean of blackmail, hoping that Mamma, to avoid my father's finding me here. Still, if she continued to refuse, would say, "Go back to your room, I'll come." It was too late. My father was there in front of us. Involuntarily, though no one heard, I murmured these words, "I'm done for." It was not so. My father was constantly refusing me permission for things that had been authorized in the more generous covenants granted by my mother and grandfather, because he did not bother about principles, and for them there was no rule of law. For a completely contingent reason, or even for no reason at all, he would at the last minute deny me a certain walk that was so customary, so consecrated, that to deprive me of it was a violation, or so as he had done once. Again this evening, long before the ritual hour, he would say to me, "Go on now, up to bed, no arguments." But also because he had no principles in my grandmother's sense, he also was not strictly speaking intransigent. He looked at me for a moment with an expression of surprise and annoyance. Then, as soon as Mamma had explained to him with a few embarrassed words what had happened, he said to her, "Go along with him then. You were just saying you didn't feel very sleepy. Stay in his room for a while. I don't need anything." "But my dear," answered my mother timidly, "whether I'm sleepy or not, it doesn't change anything. We can't let the child get into this habit." "But it isn't a question of habit," said my father, shrugging his shoulders. "You can see the boy is upset. He looks very sad. We're not executors. You'll end up making him ill, and that won't do us much good. There are 2 beds in his room. Go tell Francois to prepare the big one for you and sleep there with him tonight. Go then, good night. I'm not as high-strung as the 2 of you. I'm going to bed." It was impossible to thank my father. He would have been irritated by what he called mawkishness. I stood there not daring to move. He was still there in front of us, tall in his white nightshirt under the pink and violet Indian cashmere shawl that he had tied around his head, now that he had attacks of neuralgia, with a gesture of Abraham in the engraving of Benozzo Guzzoli that Monsieur Swann had given me, as he told Sarah she must leave Isaac's side. This was many years ago. The staircase wall on which I saw the rising glimmer of his candle has long since ceased to exist. In me, too, many things have been destroyed that I thought were bound to last forever, and new ones have formed and given birth to new sorrows and joys which I could not have foreseen, just as the old ones have become difficult for me to understand. It was a very long time ago, too, that my father ceased to be able to say, "Mamma, go with the boy. The possibility of such hours will never be reformed for me." But for a little while now, I have begun to hear again very clearly, if I take care to listen, the sobs that I was strong enough to contain in front of my father, and that broke out only when I found myself alone again with Mamma. They have never really stopped. And it is only because life is now becoming quieter around me that I can hear them again. Those covenant bells, so covered by the clamor of the town during the day that one would think they had ceased altogether, but which begin sounding again in the silence of the evening. Mamma spent that night in my room, when I had just committed such a misdeed that I expected to have to leave the house. My parents granted me more than I could have ever want from them as a reward for any good deed. Even at the moment when it manifested myself through this pardon, my father's conduct toward me retained that arbitrary and undeserved quality that characterized it, and was due to the fact that it generally resulted from fortuitous convenience rather than a premeditated plan. It may even be that what I call his severity, when he sent me to bed, deserved that name less than my grandmother's or mother's, for his nature, in certain respects, more different from mine than theirs was, had probably kept him from discovering, until now, how very unhappy I was every evening, something my mother and grandmother knew very well. But they loved me enough not to consent to spare me from my suffering. They wanted to teach me to master it in order to reduce my nervous sensitivity and strengthen my will. As for my father, whose affection for me was of another sort, I do not know if he would have been courageous enough for that. The one time he realized that I was upset, he had said to my mother, "Go and comfort him," and Mamma stayed in my room that night, and as not to allow any remorse to spoil those hours which were so different from what I had had any right to expect, when Francois, realizing that something extraordinary had happened, when she saw Mamma sitting next to me, holding my hand and letting me cry without scolding me, asked her, "Why, madame, what's wrong with monsieur that he's crying so?" Mamma answered her, "Why, even he doesn't know Francois. He's in a state. Prepare the big bed for me quickly, and then go up to bed yourself." And so for the first time my sadness was regarded no longer as a punishable offense, but as an involuntary ailment that had been officially recognized, a nervous condition for which I was not responsible. I had the relief of no longer having to mingle qualms of conscience with the bitterness of my tears. I could cry without sin. I was also not a little proud, with respect to Francois, of this turnabout of human affairs, which, an hour after Mamma had refused to come up to my room, and had sent the disdainful answer that I should go to sleep, raised me to the dignity of a grown-up, and brought me suddenly to a sort of puberty of grief, of emancipation from tears. I ought to have been made happy. I was not. It seemed to me that my mother had just made me a first concession which must have been painful to her, that this was a first abdication on her part from the ideal that she had conceived for me, and that for the first time she, who was so courageous, had to confess herself beaten. It seemed to me that if I had just gained victory, it was over her, that I had succeeded as illness, affliction, or age might have done, in relaxing her will, in weakening her judgment. so that this evening was the beginning of a new era, which would remain a sad date. If I had dared now, I would have said to Mamma, "No, I don't want you to do this. Don't sleep here." But I was aware of the practical wisdom, the realism as it would be called now, which in her tempered my grandmother's ardently idealistic nature, and I knew that now that the harm was done, she would prefer to let me at least enjoy the soothing pleasure of it, and not disturb my father.